Avesh Koran had two of his four hands on my collar before the form master finished saying my name. That was the custom, apparently. The demonstration dummy doesn't get a bow, doesn't get a warning, doesn't get a breath. The new cadet walks to the center of the white circle, the senior takes hold, and the class learns what the descent does to a body that has never felt it. I felt his weight shift through his grip the way you feel a swell coming through the rail of a boat, long before it arrives. His upper hands tightened on my collar, his lower hands slid to the cord at my waist, and his hips turned with a kind of liquid confidence that said he had done this 600 times, and the floor had always answered. The floor didn't answer. I'd like to say I did something clever. I didn't. I dropped my weight 2 inches, set my feet the way you set them when the deck pitches to starboard with 800 pounds of crab pot swinging on the boom, and I held on to his forearms because that's what you do when something is trying to move you on a working boat. You hold on, and you stay where you are because the sea takes whatever isn't fastened down. Avesh pulled. Nothing happened. He turned his hips again, faster, with a snap that would have launched any cadet in that hall into a long, instructive arc. My boots stayed flat. Somewhere behind me, a guessy cadet made a sound like a kettle starting to boil and stifled it. The hall was called the Hall of Descent, and it was the kind of room that wanted you to feel small in it. White stone, ceilings 40 feet up, light pouring through panels of polished cloud glass so the whole place glowed like the inside of a shell. 300 first-year cadets from 11 species knelt around the central circle in rings, in the gray of the Vandral concourse, and every one of them was watching a ninth chord senior fail to move a 17-year-old human. Avesh reset his grip. I let him. His face was close to mine now, and Imbril faces are worth describing. Long, gray-violet, fine bone, with eyes set wide like a bird's and a jaw that tapers almost to a point. Beautiful, in the way an instrument is beautiful. He came from a world with a third of the gravity I grew up under, and his bones were hollow cord, and his arms had a second elbow each, and everything about how his people moved said that mass was a thing you redirected, never a thing you carried. I grew up carrying it. You are resisting incorrectly, he said. His voice was low and musical and absolutely certain. Fall. No thanks, I said. He went again. Third attempt, full commitment this time, the one they call the sixth descent, both lower hands hauling my cord skyward while the upper pair drove. My collar down and across, his whole body spiraling like water going down a drain. It is, I learned later, the throw that ends most matches at the concourse. It is taught in the 8th year. It has a poem written about it. I did the thing my Uncle Roy taught me the first week I worked his deck, age 11, when a line snapped taut and tried to take me over the side. Sit into it. Get under the pull. Let your skeleton do the arguing. 200 generations of heavy world bones settled downward, and the spiral hit all that settled weight and just stopped. For one long second we stood there, him wrapped around me like weather, me standing in it. Then his foot slipped 4 inches on the polished stone, because he had thrown everything he had into moving a thing that didn't move, and physics keeps honest books. He caught himself before he went down, but the whole hall saw the stumble. The whole hall heard his breath catch. Form Master Selavar's staff cracked against the stone. Enough. Avesh let go of me the way you put down something hot. He stepped back into perfect posture, 4 hands folded, face smooth as the floor, but his eyes had changed. They had gone from looking at me the way you look at furniture to looking at me the way you look at a problem. I want to be clear about something, because it matters for everything that came after. I was not trying to embarrass anyone. I had been on Vandral 9 days. I wanted to do my 2 years, collect the accord stipend that was paying for the Kittiwaki's new engine back home, and leave. I did not care about the descent or chords or the honor culture of a species I'd met a week and a half ago. And it turned out that not caring was the worst insult I could have offered. If I'd been afraid of them, they could have forgiven me. Selavar walked the circle once slowly. The form master was old, his gray-violet gone nearly white at the throat, his 4 arms folded into his robe so he looked like a column of smoke with a head. He stopped in front of me and looked at my boots for a long moment, then at my hands. "What is your training?" he said, not a question. Imbril don't really do questions when they're unsettled. The grammar goes flat. "Deck work," I said. "What discipline is that?" "Fishing, mostly." The silence in that hall had texture. 300 cadets trying to figure out if I was being insolent, and the honest answer was no. There's no school for what I had. There's a boat, and the North Pacific, and an uncle who pays you in respect and engine grease, and 1,000 mornings of the world trying to throw you off your feet while you do your job with numb hands. Nobody gives you a cord for it. You just get to keep being alive. "Sit down, Cadet Calder," Selavar said at last, and his voice gave away nothing at all. Avesh, again with Cadet Mole. Cadet Mole was a Farron boy with legs like a deer's, and he made a graceful, Obedient arc through the air and slapped the stone exactly the way the form intends, and the class moved on. Except it didn't. You could feel it not moving on. 3 rings of kneeling first years kept sliding their eyes toward me, and across the circle the senior demonstration cadets, the ones in the dark sashes, the ones everyone called the crest table, were not sliding their eyes anywhere. They were looking straight at me, all 4 of them, with the stillness Imbrel get when something has gone wrong with their arithmetic. My name is Owen Calder. I was 17 years old, out of Stannard Harbor, a port town you've never heard of where the main industries are salmon, crab, and leaving. I am not a soldier's son. I am nobody's experiment. I got my seat at the Vandrel Concourse, the most prestigious officer academy in 4 sectors, 11 species, 4,000 cadets, waiting list measured in generations. Because the Terran Accord owed the concourse 2 cadet seats per intake under a treaty nobody on Earth had, read, and the seats went by lottery among secondary students with physical labor certifications, and my number came up in March while I was mending pot webbing in the rain. My mother signed the consent because the stipend was real money and the boat needed an engine. My Uncle Roy drove me to the shuttle pad in a truck that smelled of diesel and old coffee, shook my hand, and said the only piece of advice anyone gave me about living among aliens. Work's work, Owen. Find what the job actually is and do that, and ignore the rest. It took me 1 class in the Hall of Descent to learn what the job actually was. The job was standing up. Everything else at the concourse, navigation, void law, fleet logistics, all of it was negotiable, curved, recoverable. But the descent was the spine of the place. It was the Imbrel gift to the Federation, the close discipline every officer of every species learned, and its single commandment was carved over the hall doors in letters a foot high: the floor is the verdict. On the Imbrel homeworld, I learned that first week gravity runs at 1/3 of Earth's. Mass is cheap there and leverage is everything, and their whole civilization's idea of dominance is organized around one binary: who left their feet and who didn't. To be thrown is not to lose a game, it is to be judged. Their word for an untrustworthy person translates literally as one who is often horizontal. 600 years ago they turned that instinct into the form of descent, 9 ranked chords, 140 named throws, and when the Federation built the concourse, the Imbrel wrote the descent into its charter as the one course no cadet may skip and no cadet may fail. In 61 years of the concourse, the form had never lost a formal match to an outsider's discipline. That statistic got recited at orientation like scripture. 61 years. I sat in the 3rd ring with my lottery seat and my taped knuckles and thought, fair enough, none of my business, and that might have been the end of it. Except that evening, in the refectory, Avish Koran walked the length of the hall to stand over my table. He did it beautifully. Imbrel do everything beautifully. In 7/10 gravity, they look like they're being poured rather than walking. He stood there with his cohort behind him, 3 more dark sashes, the crest table, the apex of the senior class, and he let the silence do its work until half the refectory was watching, and then he said, Cadet Calder, this morning was a malfunction of the floor plates. It will be corrected. I looked up from my tray. I'd had a long day of orientation lectures in a language I was hearing through an implant, and the food was a paste that tasted of low tide, and I genuinely, honestly, did not have it in me to perform whatever ritual he was holding the door open for. Okay, I said, and went back to eating. You'd have thought I'd spat on him. The musical voice came down half an octave. You concede it was the plates. Sure, I said. Whatever's easiest. I have replayed that conversation 100 times since, and I stand by it, but I also understand now exactly what I did. In Imbrel honor grammar, there are forms for defiance. Defiance is respectable. Defiance can be answered in the circle and folded back into the order of things. There are no forms for whatever's easiest. I hadn't refused the duel. I had refused the premise that he and I were in a story together at all. I had treated the heir of the Koran line, 9th court at 19, undefeated in 26 standing questions, the way you treat a seagull yelling at you on a piling. Avesh stood very still for 3 seconds. Then he turned and poured himself back down the hall, cohort folding in behind him, and the Gessi cadet sitting across from me, small, gray-quilled. Fast-eyed name of Tez, leaned over my tray and spoke in the tone you'd use to tell a man his coat is on fire. You should request a transfer tonight, Tez said. I am not joking tonight. I just got here. You don't understand what that was. It was a guy being told no, I said. We have those at home. Tez's quills flattened slowly, which I would learn meant roughly the same thing as a man putting his head in his hands. No, he said. What that was the crest table deciding you don't get to be furniture anymore. You've been promoted, deck boy. You're a project now. I finished the paste. Past the serving line, on the far wall, a cloud glass panel looked out over the plateau, white tiers of the concourse. Stepping down toward a sea of cloud 1,000 feet below, 2 moons coming up pale in a green evening sky, the whole alien postcard of it. Somewhere under all that cloud, the planet went on doing whatever it did, indifferent, and I found that comforting. The sea back home was indifferent too. Indifferent I knew how to work with. Let them have their project, I said. I'm here for 22 months. I'm going to do my hours, pass my boards, take the stipend, and go home and fish. Tez looked at me with his head tilted all the way over, fast black eyes going over my face like he was reading a gauge that had to be broken. That's the strangest part, he said at last. You actually mean it. The project started small, the way weather does. My boots disappeared from the dormitory rack on the 11th day and came back on the 12th, soaked through with something that smelled like ammonia and never fully dried again. My bunk assignment got corrected to the berth directly under the air handler, where the temperature dropped to 4 degrees every night cycle. My name fell off the ration roster twice in 1 week, which meant standing in the appeals line for an hour each time while the refectory emptied out around me. None of it had fingerprints on it. All of it was legal. Tez, who had appointed himself my interpreter of institutional menace, walked me through the mechanics. The crest table didn't do anything so crude as orders. Avesh and his 3, Resavan the big one, built like a loading crane. Othek, the quiet one, who watched everything and said nothing. Soon, the talker, who smiled with too many teeth for an imbril, simply let it be known that I was disfavored, and the machinery of 4,000 status-conscious cadets did the rest on its own. The point isn't the boots, Tez said. The point is to teach you what your life costs here. Then they offer to stop, and you owe them, and you're folded in. It's how the table runs the senior class. It's how it's run the senior class for 30 years. And if I just keep buying new boots. Nobody's ever just kept buying new boots. The colder instrument was the one with no objects in it at all. By the 3rd week, first years who'd been friendly enough at orientation had stopped meeting my eye. Lab partners developed scheduling conflicts. A Farron girl who'd asked me about Earth oceans for a full hour on the 2nd day now took the long way around the refectory to avoid passing my table, and did it with the miserable, apologetic precision of someone obeying instructions she hated. That was the table's real craft, Tez explained. They never ordered isolation. They just made proximity expensive and let 4,000 careful careerists run the cost-benefit on their own. Within a month, the only cadet who'd sit with me was Tez himself, who as a guessie from a low registry line had, in his words, no altitude left to fall from, which is the only kind of freedom this place sells. I wrote home about none of it. My mother got a letter every 8 days, concourse relay to Earth packet, and the letter said the food was strange and the gravity was easy, and the navigation courses were good and I was fine. All true, every word, because a deckhand's letters home are a curated cargo and always have been. Roy got one line at the bottom of each, our whole correspondence. Weather's trying. Holding, he'd know what it meant. He's the one who taught me that the only 2 facts a wheelhouse ever needs from the deck are those. So I kept buying new boots. I am not made of special material. I want that understood. But there is a kind of training nobody hands out cords for, and it's the training of a deck in February, when you've spent winters being slapped in the face by the bearings idea of a joke, ice in your gloves, gear that fails at 3 in the morning, a hold that needs packing no matter what your hands think about it. A cold bunk is a cold bunk. I'd slept colder on a boat that was also trying to drown me. I got an extra blanket from stores, signed the chit, and slept fine, and somewhere in the dormitory dark, I could feel the frustration of an audience watching a play where the lead actor wouldn't read his lines. Meanwhile, in the Hall of Descent, the curriculum and I were having our own quiet disagreement. Every cadet at the concourse passes the descent in stages. First chord requirements, due by the end of the opening term. Demonstrate the 8 basic falls. Demonstrate 3 throws against a compliant partner, and survive 30 seconds in the circle against an instructor without, and I quote the rubric, disgraceful descent. The falls are the foundation. The form is half about throwing and half about being thrown well, landing in the approved shapes, slapping the stone, rising in cadence. The floor is the verdict, but the form also teaches you to lose with your paperwork in order. I could not pass the falls assessment, not because I couldn't fall, because I couldn't fall their way. The first time Proctor Lem ran my cohort through it, he put me with a partner, poor Cadet Mole again, and instructed Mole to execute the second throw, a simple hip turn, so that I could demonstrate the second fall. Mole took my collar and cord, turned his hips, and bounced off me. He tried 4 times. By the 4th, he was sweating from glands I didn't know Farron had, and the line behind us had backed up, and Lem was standing very close with his data slate hanging loose in his grip. Lem was a Mon, broad, amphibious, skin like wet river stone, a voice that came from somewhere down near his ballast. He was also, I'd learned, the closest thing the descent faculty had to a fair-minded man. He told Mole to stand down. He looked at me the way harbor masters look at a hull that's wrong in some way they can't name yet. Cadet Calder. The assessment requires you to be thrown. I understand, Proctor. Then descend. He's trying his best, I said. I'm not doing anything. Which was true, and which was the problem. I wasn't countering. Countering they had techniques for. Countering lived inside the form's universe. What I was doing lived underneath it. Standing low, weight settled, grip like a man holding a rail, there was no entry in the rubric for the throw, simply failing to occur. Lem made Mole try twice more, then took hold of me himself, and Amon Proctor has the mass of a small car, and that worked no better, because mass alone has never once moved a man who knows how to stand on a moving deck, and the Hall of Descent, for all its 40-foot ceilings, was the stillest floor I'd ever been asked to keep my feet on. The stone didn't pitch, it didn't roll. Nothing about that room was trying to kill me. Standing still in it was a vacation. Lem released me, stepped back, and entered something long on his slate. Assessment deferred, he said in his under-the-hull voice. Pending rubric review. That phrase, pending rubric review, went around the first-year class by dinner. By breakfast, it had grown a body and a wardrobe. The human can't be thrown. By the end of the week, second- and third-year cadets I'd never met were finding reasons to walk past my training slot, and soon of the crest table had started calling me the bollard in the refectory, which he meant as an insult, and which I privately thought was the most accurate thing anyone had said about me since I'd left home. A bollard is a post you tie ships to. It does its one job. Ships that argue with it lose. Twice that month, the table tried to fix the malfunction in person. The first time, Resivan caught me at the gear racks after evening drill, when the hall had thinned to stragglers. He was the biggest imbrel at the concourse, half a meter over me, all forearms bare, and he picked the time and place the way you pick them when you want witnesses but not authorities. Enough eyes to carry the story, no proctor to write it down. He took my shoulder with one upper hand and spun me, and the spin worked, because I wasn't braced and I weigh what I weigh. You can always turn a man. Then the two lower hands came in for the cord and collar, the standard entry, the start of 600 years of inevitability. Here's what they don't know about deckhands, because how would they? Our hands are our trade. 40 hours a week of line, web, potwire, and gaff from age 11 in cold that makes you grip harder. A grip dynamometer at my intake physical on Earth had made the nurse laugh out loud and call her colleague over. I closed my hands around Resivan's two lower wrists, and I watched the information travel up his arms into his face. Imbrel wrists are fine-boned, hollow cord, built for a world that doesn't fight you. You'll want to let go of the collar, I said. He didn't. So I tightened gradually, the way you take up a line, no jerk, no violence. Just less and less room in the world, and his fingers opened on their own, one joint at a time, because his fingers were doing arithmetic his pride hadn't caught up to yet. I put his wrists back where they'd come from, the way you return borrowed tools. Plates must be malfunctioning again, I said, and shouldered my bag, and left him standing at the racks with 11 witnesses developing stories to tell. The second attempt was smarter, because Othek planned it, and Othek was the one of the four I'd have hired. They waited 3 weeks, until the night before the navigation midterm, and they got me in the freight spine. The concourse is built down a plateau in tiers, and the freight spine is its service stairwell, a square shaft of cargo stairs and lift rails. Running the height of the academy, all bare alloy and work lighting, the one ugly room in a place built beautiful. I liked it. I'd found it my first week, and I'd made it mine, because it was the only place on Vandrel that felt like work. I'd load a sea bag with spare plating from the salvage bin, set the bag on my shoulder, and run the stairs down and up, in the dark hours when the spine was empty. Not for anybody's program, for me, because 7/10 gravity is a holiday that makes you soft, and because a man needs 1 hour a day where the job is simple and the weight is honest, and because if I closed my eyes between landings, the rhythm of boots on alloy steps was nearly the ladder down to the Kittiwake's hold. I never closed my eyes again in the freight spine after that night. They were waiting at the landing of Tier 9, all 4 of them, out of uniform, in training blacks. And I will give Othek this. He had done his reading. The freight spine's gravity plates run on a maintenance band, adjustable landing by landing, so crews can float heavy cargo, and they had tuned the whole flight to 2/10 standard. Imbrel gravity, lighter. Their world, their physics, their form. Avesh stood at the rail with his 4 arms folded, and for once there was no music in his voice at all. No proctors on the spine after second bell, he said. No plates to blame, no rubric to hide in. You will descend tonight, Cadet Calder, one way or the other, and tomorrow the order of things will resume. I set the sea bag down on the landing, 40 kilos of salvage plate, suddenly weighing 8 in the thinned-out pull, and my own body gone balloon light and wrong, and 4 trained imbrel uncoiling off the rail into the space around me the way water surrounds a stone. You picked stairs, I said, and rolled my shoulders loose, and felt something old and cold and patient come up in me that had nothing to do with any academy. 11 years on ladders and you pick stairs. Soon came first because Soon always went first. It's what talkers are for. He came in fast and beautiful off the rail, riding the thin gravity like it was his. And it was his. That was the whole idea. Both upper hands reaching for my collar in the classic entry. In 2/10 gravity, a man weighs almost nothing. Here is what the crest table had not thought through, because their whole species physics had never required them to. In 2/10 gravity, everyone weighs almost nothing. The descent works because the thrower stays planted while the thrown man's mass swings around the anchor of him. Thin the pull, and there are no anchors. There's just two bodies in the dark, and the one who wins is the one who spent his life fastened to things. I had one hand on the freight rail before Soon ever touched me. 3 points of contact. The first law of ladders, holds and rigging, drilled into me before my voice broke. The sea takes whatever isn't fastened down. Soon got his grip, turned his hips into the spiral, and swung himself in a wide, helpless arc around the fixed point of me, because I was bolted to the concourse by one deckhand's grip on a cargo rail, and he was bolted to nothing at all. I let go of his collar at the top of the arc. He drifted into the stairwell wall with a sound like a dropped kayak and slid down it, all that beauty suddenly bereft of a floor to be beautiful against. Rail, Othik said sharply from the control panel, smart one. Take the rail away. Resavan and Avesh came together, one high, one low, and they were not first years, and this was not a demonstration. 4 arms apiece, 8 hands between them, and every one of them educated. Resavan's job was the rail, both his lower hands prying at my grip while his mass crowded me off it, and Avesh's job was me. He got his cord and collar entry at last, hips coiling, and in that featherweight nothing he could finally do it, finally turn me, and my boots left the floor of the landing for the first time since I'd come to Vandrel. Deckhands fall for a living too. Nobody writes poems about it. I didn't fight the turn. You don't fight the sea. Roy says you fight your own panic. I went with it, took the stairwell rail across my back instead of my head, and the edge of it found my ribs on the left side, and something back there gave a flat, ugly crack like green wood. I came down on the steps in a heap that no rubric would have approved of. The pain arrived a half-second later, the way it does, and it was a familiar kind of mail, cracked rib. I'd had 2 before. A pothauler had handed me one at 15. You can work with a cracked rib, you'd rather not. Nobody asks. Avesh stood over me on the landing in the work light, and I watched him begin to relax. The order of things resuming, the horizontal human filed where humans belonged, and that is the exact moment the crest table lost the war, although none of us knew it yet. Because he stood over me, and he straightened his sash with 2 hands while the other 2 hung easy. And he looked down from all that restored height, and he said, "The floor is the verdict." And I started laughing. It hurt like a gaff hook, and I couldn't help it, and of everything I did that year, I think the laugh frightened them the most. "That's not a floor," I said, getting a hand on the rail. "That's a setting on a dial." Then I pulled, and the arm did what 11 years of pot-hauling built it to do, and I came up the rail hand over hand with my boots barely touching, because if they could borrow their gravity, then so could I. Othik saw where I was headed 1 full second too late. The maintenance panel at Tier 9 landing is a yellow box with a guard bar and a dial, and I'd run these stairs 5 nights a week for 6 weeks and watch the cargo crews work it, and the dial went from 2/10 to standard with 1/4 turn, and past standard to the load test band with 1 more. I turned it to 1.1. Earth and Change, the band the crews used to proof test pallet rigs, the band I ran my stair sets at every night, with 40 kilos of salvage on my shoulder, sweating alone in the dark like an idiot, for no reason I could have named out loud without sounding homesick. Gravity came back on like a verdict of its own. I have spent my whole life at 1 full G, and I will not pretend the load test band is comfortable. It sat on my cracked rib like a second injury, and my knees took it the way they take a hard deck after a long swell, but I'd carried it before. It was just weight, and weight is honest. The Imbril had never carried it in their lives. Soon, already down, flattened to the stairs like a tide chart. Resavan dropped to 1 knee with all 4 arms spread. A crane finally asked to lift its own boom. Othik folded against the wall, hollow bones suddenly bearing triple their design load. And Avesh Koran, 9th chord, heir of the Koran line, stood. I'll give him that forever, he stood, but he stood the way a man stands in a hurricane. Every line of that poured water grace gone rigid and trembling, and for the first time since he'd put his hands on my collar on day 9, he and I were finally in the same classroom. I picked up my sea bag, 40 kilos again, plus interest. I put it on my right shoulder, on account of the rib, and I walked up the stairs past him, 1 tread at a time, not fast, because a deckhand on a working deck doesn't ever hurry and doesn't ever stop. At the turn of the landing, I looked back down at the 4 of them pinned in the amber work light. "I'll put the dial back from the top," I said. Give it a minute. Breathe shallow, move one limb at a time, don't fight it, it's just wait. And then, because my rib was singing and I was 19 light years from a town that smelled of diesel and salt and rain, and because some piece of me was done pretending I didn't understand exactly what kind of men they were, I added the only sermon I have ever given in my life. Where I'm from, the floor isn't the verdict, the water is. The water doesn't care about your chords or your line or your name, and it has never once lost, and every man I respect has been knocked flat by it 100 times. Getting put down isn't the thing, you understand? It's never been the thing. The thing is what you do while you're getting up. Nobody answered. I reset the dial at Tier 8 and climbed the rest of the way to the dormitories. At a polite 7/10, and behind and below me the freight spine stayed very quiet for a long while. I didn't report it. Tez spent 2 days trying to talk me into reporting it, fast-eyed and furious, quills up, citing chapter and clause of the Concourse Conduct Code, and I let him run out of citations and then told him what I'd have told a greenhorn who got checked into a bulkhead by a deck boss. You don't fix a crew with paperwork. Either the work sorts it or nothing does. This isn't a crew, Tez said. This is an aristocracy with a gym. Same thing, I said. Worse weather at home is all. But 2 things came out of the freight spine all the same, because nothing on a station-sized campus stays in a stairwell. The first was the rib. I taped it myself, the way Roy taught me. He'd have used duct tape and called me lucky, and I got most of a week away with it before Proctor Lem, running the first chords through Holds drills, watched me guard my left side through 1 rotation too many. Mon don't have expressive faces. They have ballast. He settled half a meter lower in front of me, which I'd learned was his version of a stare. Cadet. The origin of that injury. Stairs, Proctor. He let the silence sit there between us, patient as river water, long enough for both of us to acknowledge everything the word stairs contained. Because the freight spine's maintenance log was a public record if anyone cared to pull it, and somebody had pulled it. I could see that in the set of him. Tier 9, second bell, 2/10 to 1.1 and back, 4 cadet access, chits and mine. Stairs. He said at last and entered a single line on his slate, and what he entered, I found out much later, was Cadet Calder. Injury consistent with account given. Account incomplete. Cadet declines escalation. Note for file. In 61 years, this proctor has never before recorded a first year that the senior class is afraid of. The second thing that came out of the freight spine was quieter. And worse. And I didn't see it coming because I was watching the wrong people. The crest table stopped touching me. No more boots, no more roster errors, no more cold bunk. For 11 days, nothing. A silence so complete it should have read as a falling barometer, and didn't because I wanted it to be over. They'd learned exactly what I'd taught them in the stairwell. Don't grab the bollard. Ships that argue with it lose. So they went looking for something tied to it instead. The 11 quiet days weren't quiet everywhere. They were only quiet around me, and I was slow to understand the difference. Around me, things were improving in ways I had no hand in. A Farron second year I'd never spoken to returned my salvage bag to the dormitory rack after a cleaning crew misplaced it and looked me in the eye while he did it, which Farron do not do for strangers. The refectory line stopped developing mysterious gaps in front of me. Cadet Mole started sitting at our corner table without being asked, and then a Mon girl from hydrostatics, and then 2 more Farron, and Tez presided over the head of it with his quills at the satisfied angle of a harbor master watching traffic come back to a port everyone had written off. You understand what this table is, he said one evening, fast eyes going down the bench. Every cadet sitting here has been disfavored at some point in the last 3 years. This is the bad weather table. You've made it weatherproof. I haven't done anything. You keep saying that, Tez said, like it's a defense. It's the whole indictment. You haven't done anything. You just kept standing there, and the sky didn't fall on you, and now everyone's looking up and asking what else the sky's been lying about. But the crest table hadn't conceded anything. They'd changed instruments, and the instrument they picked, in the last month of the term, was the one I should have seen coming, because it was the only one left that was both legal and public, the curriculum itself. The winter practicum is the concourse's oldest field examination. 3 days on the high shelf at the plateau, all first years, full kit, cold weather survival and load-bearing assessments under proctor observation. And by tradition, the senior class administers it. Seniors set the courses, weigh the kits, time the circuits. Proctors observe, seniors operate. You can see the shape of the opportunity from orbit. The centerpiece of day 2 is the yard tally, an old Imbrel endurance form, a measured circuit of the high yard carried under load, each lap logged. Cadets going until they elect to stop or a proctor stops them. The load is standardized to body mass. It is, the manual says, an assessment of judgment as much as endurance. Knowing your own structural limits is officer knowledge, and the tally's lesson for most species is the dignified discovery of where those limits sit. Resivan ran the weighing station. I watched him rack my kit, and I watched the rack, and the standardized load for my mass class was 31 kilos, and what went onto my shoulders, by the time 3 seniors had verified the calibration twice, was a quiet, deniable, timestamp 44. I know it was 44 because I know what 44 kilos feels like across my shoulders the way you know your own name. It's a heavy pot day on. The kid awake, it's the bottom half of a deck crane's bad mood, it's Tuesday. The scale display, angled away from the observing proctor, said 31. Resivan looked at me over the rack with all 4 arms folded, and there was nothing in his face at all, and that nothing was the entire message. Complain, and you're the human who couldn't carry what every Farron child carries. Carry it, and we'll find out what breaks first, your back or your bookkeeping. The high yard sat at 9 degrees below, freezing under a wind coming off the cloud sea with nothing to slow it down. For 1,000 miles, half the first years were shivering before the start line. I stood in the queue with 44 kilos of deniable arithmetic on my back, and the honest, embarrassing truth is that something in me came fully awake for the first time since the shuttle had lifted off Earth, because cold, wind, weight, wet, and a supervisor cooking the numbers. That isn't an alien examination, that's the job description I grew up under. They had, with great care and considerable institutional risk, arranged for me to spend a day commuting to work. The tallies lesson is the dignified discovery of limits. Here's the tally, then, as it went into the record, with Proctor Lem's annotations preserved because Tez pulled the file later and made me read it. Lap 9, the median first year, load down, assessment complete, judgment satisfactory. Lap 14, the last Farron stopped, applauded, helped to the warming tent. Lap 17, the strongest mon in our intake, a kid built like a harbor wall, set his kit down with ceremony, and the seniors at the timing station began watching their own assessment with an attention the yard tally had not earned in years. Lap 20, a cluster of 4th years arrived at the rail with no administrative reason to be there. Lap 23, Lem's slate, preserved in the record, Cadet Calder's gate unchanged since lap 2. Query, recalibrate timing instruments. Lap 26, the wind picked up to the kind of voice I knew, and I stopped hearing the yard entirely. I was somewhere off Cape Stannard, counting pots, and a part of me that had been clenched since March Lego, and my pace, the record says, improved. Lap 30, Lem formally reweighed the standardized kits at the rack, all 31 kilos, immaculate, because Othic's people had swapped the rack between starts. Whatever else I say about them, they were never sloppy. Lap 33, the first years on the rail began calling the count out loud. All species, in their own languages, a ragged carol of numbers in the wind, and no senior could find a regulation against counting. Lap 36, Proctor Lem stepped into the circuit and stopped the assessment on the recorded grounds that the light was failing, the temperature was dropping past exercise limits, and annotation, verbatim, continuation serves no further assessment purpose. Subject's limit not located. Recommend the tallies rubric be reviewed for heavy gravity species, as this instrument does not measure them. It merely employs them. I set the kit down at the rack the way you set a load down, and my legs told me about it for 2 days. And I want that in the record too. It cost 44 kilos and 36 laps below freezing is not nothing to a human. It's a long shift. But a long shift is a thing I'd done several hundred of before my 17th birthday, and not one of them had ever come with a crowd counting my laps in 11 languages. And I'd be lying if I said the carol of it didn't carry me the last 4. The table had built a public demonstration. They got one. It just demonstrated the wrong thing. The way the boots had, the way the cold bunk had, the way the stairwell had, and walking down off the high shelf in the dusk. With first years I'd never met falling in beside my shoulder like gulls behind a boat, I finally understood the season for what it was. Every machine they ran me through was a scale with the display turned away. They kept reading 31. The needle kept saying something else, and the room had started leaning around the proctor's shoulder to look. Soon stopped calling me the bollard around then. Not because it had failed as an insult, because it had finished becoming a title, and the crest table heard it moving through the underclass benches in tones they couldn't supervise. And a name you've lost control of is worse than no name at all. 3 days after we came down from the high shelf, the runner came with the gray slate, and the form master made his move before the table could make theirs. The summons came on a gray slate carried by a first chord runner, Cadet Calder, Hall of Descent, third bell alone. Third bell is the dead hour at the concourse, between last drill and dinner, when the halls empty out. I came in through the great doors under the floor is the verdict and found the place lit low, the cloud glass gone the color of an oyster shell, and Form Master Selavar standing in the center of the white circle with his robe off. I had never seen an old Imbrel out of a robe. He was all line and joint, gray-violet faded to driftwood, forearms bare, and he stood in that enormous empty room the way a mast stands on a boat. 60 years of the form stood there with him. Whatever I thought about chords, I know craft when it's in front of me. Cadet Calder, he said. No proctors, no rubric, no record, take hold of me. Respectfully, Form Master, I don't want anything from this. I know, he said. That is the only reason I am asking. So I took hold of him, collar and cord, the basic entry they teach the first chords, and what happened over the next quarter hour I have trouble putting in order, because it was the closest thing to weather I ever met indoors. He didn't try to throw me, not the way Avesh had. All certainty and spiral, he listened with his hands. He'd shift 2 ounces of pressure and wait to feel what my feet did about it. He'd turn a half degree and read the answer in my grip. It was exactly what you do with a new boat in a following sea, and I knew within a minute that I was in the circle with the only person at the concourse who'd ever bothered to ask the water what it thought before arguing with it. And then, once, without any warning I could name, the floor went out from under my right foot. He'd done something with timing, not force, caught the half second where my weight crossed over, and I had to take 3 fast steps to keep my feet, all the way to the edge of the circle. First time anything at the concourse had moved me an inch. The old man watched my recovery steps the way a buyer watches fish come off the boat. He said, there it is. There what is? You can be moved, Selavar said. Between weights in the crossing moment. 1 half step of doubt lives in you, mid-transfer. A master would need perfect timing to find it, and would need you tired, and would likely need you hurt. He refolded all 4 arms. I am telling you this freely, Cadet, and you are wondering why. I was. On a crew you'd never hand a man the chart of your own reefs. Because the form is not the crest table, he said. And for one moment the flat grammar cracked and something very old came through it. 600 years ago, the descent was made to teach the strong what the floor teaches. That anyone can be put down, that everyone is put down, that the putting down is survivable and the rising is the art. We built a discipline out of humility, Cadet Calder. And somewhere across the generations on this campus, it has been turned into a machine for sorting who matters. A boy like Avesh Koran has never once been horizontal in his life. Do you understand what that has done to him? He's our art's every technique and none of its knowledge. You walked in off a fishing boat carrying the knowledge and not one technique. The concourse has no shelf to put you on. You are the first thing in 61 years that the form has had a chance to learn from, and the institution's entire instinct is to sand you smooth instead. He turned away, robe pouring back over his shoulders. Your falls assessment is resolved, incidentally. Proctor Lem's review was elegant. You will demonstrate the 8 falls solo from the vault horse on the count. The rubric requires correct descent. It has never actually specified that another cadet must cause it. And the 30 seconds in the circle against an instructor? The old Imbrel looked back at me, and I will swear to my last day that something amused moved through those wide-set bird eyes. I will conduct that assessment personally, he said. I expect it will be the easiest 30 seconds of your term. That is precisely what worries me. Go to dinner, Cadet. I went to dinner. And I did the falls the next morning off the vault horse in front of Lem and a slate and 40 curious first years. 8 falls, called in sequence. Each one landed in the approved shape with the approved slap, textbook, because of course I could fall. I'd been falling my whole life, off ladders, off pot stacks, off the gunwale into the hold, and the only difference between my falling and theirs was that nobody had ever graded mine before. Lem stamped the slate. First chord falls requirement, passed, method annotated. Half the hall came to watch the human who couldn't be thrown throw himself, and I heard later the recording traveled up through all 4 year classes by nightfall, and I want it noted that I did the 8th fall with a cracked rib and didn't say one word about it, and that this, more than anything I did in any circle, is what the term deckhand means. For about a week, the weather was almost fair. My boards were good. Void navigation came easy. Anyone who has run a boat through fog on radar and dead reckoning finds orbital mechanics merely honest, and fleet logistics came easier. Provisioning a frigate is provisioning a crab boat with more zeros. Tez and I had a corner table in the refectory now, and a couple of Farron first years had started sitting at it, and Cadet Mole, who'd bounced off me a dozen times without complaint, made it 5. On a boat, we'd have called that a crew forming. I should have remembered that the table could see it forming too. Because here is what I'd done without meaning to do anything. I'd become load-bearing. The whole architecture of the senior class ran on one assumption, that disfavor was fatal, that no one survived being a project, and I'd been a project for a term and was visibly publicly fine. Cadets had watched the machine work on me and watched the machine lose. Boots stopped disappearing from other racks too. That's the part I learned later. The table's whole economy of fear ran on demonstration, and their demonstration model was eating dinner at a corner table, passing his boards, healing a rib nobody could prove. Aristocracies don't die of defiance, they die of indifference catching on. So the crest table did the arithmetic I'd taught them in the stairwell, don't grab the bollard, and reached instead for the smallest boat tied to it. It happened at logistics review in front of 200 cadets, and it was Soon who built it because demolition like this was what Soon was for. Tez was presenting, third years presented quarterly, and Tez, whatever his size, was the best logistics mind in his year, fast-eyed, fast-handed, the kind of cadet who'd have made a fortune running a cannery, and his presentation slate had been got at, not crudely. The supply figures he'd verified that morning had been re-derived from a falsified base table, so that every number he presented was subtly, defensively wrong, and when he asserted them, confidently because he'd checked them, because checking was his whole nature. Soon rose from the senior benches with a copy of the true base table and took him apart joint by joint, front of the assembled cohorts. I was on the benches for all of it, and I want to describe what it's like to watch a friend be professionally demolished, because the watching was the point. The whole performance was addressed to me. Soon never raised his voice. He asked for the derivation of the convoy figure, and Tez gave it, and it was wrong, and Tez could see it was wrong the moment it left his mouth. You could watch him rerunning the arithmetic behind his eyes at the speed guess he run, it which is very fast, and arriving at the same impossible answer, because the error wasn't in his work, it was under his work. In bedrock he'd had no reason to test. Soon asked for the next figure, gentle as a nurse, and the next. Each one a small public wrongness with Tez's name attached. 200 cadets doing the spectator shift from sympathy to embarrassment to the appalled fascination that crowds are built of. And on the senior bench Avesh watched with courteous attention, and Othik watched nothing at all. And I sat there doing my own arithmetic about exits and aisle widths and how many rows I could cross before a proctor reached me, and Roy's voice in my head saying the thing he says when a man wants to jump into someone else's fight on someone else's terms. Wrong tide, Owen. Wait for your water. That alone would have been a bad afternoon. Then Soon closed the trap. He asked Tez mildly in front of 200 witnesses whether the errors were incompetence or fabrication, and Tez, being exhausted and ambushed and exactly as brave as he was small, said the true thing instead of the safe thing. Neither, he said. The base table was altered, and everyone in this room knows whose sash that work has on it. A guessy third year, in open assembly, had just accused the crest table of falsifying academy records, without proof, because the alteration had been done with chits that would trace to a dead-end maintenance account. Because Othek planned things properly. The hall went silent the way the sea goes flat before a willowaw. Avesh Korn stood up from the senior benches without hurry. He straightened his sash with 2 hands while the other 2 hung easy, and I was the only one in that hall who'd seen that exact gesture before, on a freight landing, standing over a man he believed he'd finally filed in his proper place. He looked at Tez the way you look at a knot you intend to undo, and he spoke the formula that I'd heard about in orientation and assumed, the way you assume things about lifeboats that I would never personally see used. Cadet Tez of the Gessi, he said, his voice carrying to the back rings without effort. You have placed an aspersion upon my line that words cannot lift. I put to you the standing question. Beside me, Cadet Mole made a small sound and went the color of bad weather. I leaned to Tez's other side and asked the only question I had. What happens if he says no? He can't say no. Mole's voice had dropped to nothing. Refusing the question means standing in doubt. Every door at the concourse closes, every posting board skips your name forever. And answering it means the circle. Descent rules. Tomorrow at first bell. I looked at Tez, 11 kilos of him, quills flat with shock, the best logistics mind in his year, who had sat down across from a friendless human his first night and told him the truth about what the refectory silence meant. I looked at Avesh Koran, 9th chord, undefeated in 26 standing questions, who had needed 3 months in a falsified table to find a way to put his hands on me again. Okay, I said, and stood up. 200 cadets watched a first-year human stand up in open assembly, and I'd love to tell you I had a plan, but what I had was a custom Mole had explained to me in a corridor 3 weeks earlier, back when I was collecting concourse rules the way you collect local knowledge in a new harbor, half listening, storing it with the tide tables. The standing question is older than the academy. It came down from the Emerald dueling courts, and like all old law it has joints in it, worn smooth where generations of clever people have needed it to bend, and one of its joints is this: an aspersion belongs to whoever asserts it. If a second voice claims the same aspersion as their own, knowingly, formally, in open hearing, then the question may be put to either voice, and it must be put to the graver one. The law's whole logic is that an insult is a debt, and debts attached to the largest estate willing to own them. Cadet Avesh, I said into all that silence. My voice sounded strange to me in the big hall, flat and carrying, my mother's voice when she's done discussing something. Before you put your question, I want the record straight on who's asserting what. He turned. The whole senior bench turned. Somewhere up in the faculty gallery, slates stopped moving. Cadet Tez says your table altered his base figures, I said. I say it too. I say it as my own claim, knowingly in open hearing, whatever the formula is. Mole, what's the formula? Mole, rigid beside me, supplied it in a whisper, and bless him forever, his whisper carried like a bell in that acoustic. I take the aspersion for my own. I take the aspersion for my own, I said, and I'll go further than he did, so there's no doubt about whose claim is graver. Cadet Tez said the work had your table's sash on it. I say it had your hand on it, Avesh Koran, yours and Othik's chits behind a dead maintenance account, the same way your table's hands were on my boots in the first month, and my ration roster, and the gravity dial at Tier 9 landing at second bell, which is in the Freight Spine's maintenance log, time-stamped, public record, for anyone in this room who enjoys reading. I let that travel to the back rings, and watch 200 sets of alien eyes do exactly what eyes do at a dock fight in any port in the universe. Now, I'm told the question goes to the graver claim. Mine's graver. Put it to me. You could hear the cloud glass creak. To his credit, and I came to believe later that there was credit in him, buried where his line had buried it. Avesh didn't look at his table for instructions. Soon had half risen with some objection forming. Othik's stillness had gone from architectural to absolute, which I'd learned was Othik's version of alarm, because the freight spine log was a thread, and threads pull. Avesh stood considering me across the assembly hall the way he'd considered me across a freight landing, and I watched the arithmetic move through him, and it was simple arithmetic, and it had one answer, refuse, and the room hears the heir of the Koran line decline his own question against a first-year lottery human, with a maintenance log glowing in the public record behind him. Accept. And he gets the thing his whole season of small cruelties had been reaching for since day 9, my body. In his circle, under his rules, with the entire concourse watching the order of things resume. The question stands, Avesh said, to Cadet Calder. The aspersion is his. At first bell, I asked? At first bell. Fine, I sat back down. My hands were steady, and I want that in the record too, not because I'm brave, but because of what it actually was. I had finally, after a full term and a place made of ceremony, been handed a job with edges. Deck work, find what the job actually is and do that, and ignore the rest. Tez didn't say anything until the assembly broke, the hall emptying around us in a roar of 11 species worth of speculation. Then he sat very still with his quills at angles I'd never seen and said, "You don't know what you just took. I took a fight off a guy half my weight. You took a standing question against the 9th chord. 26 questions, Owen. He has answered the question 26 times since his 4th year, and 26 cadets went horizontal inside the first exchange, and 4 of them never came back to the circle at all. It's not the freight spine. There's no dial. It's the hall of descent at house gravity, his art, his floor, his 600 years. The quills flattened all the way, and you can't win even if you win. You understand that? Put him down and you've humiliated the Koran line in formal circle, and the whole senior structure turns on you. Stay up and refuse to fight, and it's a draw, and the question stands forever. This is why nobody answers, Owen. The circle isn't a fight. It's a sorting machine. I thought about it. Outside the cloud glass, the evening had gone green and both moons were up, and 1,000 feet down the cloud sea moved against the plateau like the ghost of an honest ocean. You done? I'm done. Then here's the part nobody on this campus has factored, because none of you grew up working water. I stacked our trays, because work's work, even when the weather's coming. Every machine they've run me through since I got here, the hazing, the rubric, the stairwell, now this, every one of them is built on the same gear, the other fellow's fear of going down. Take the fear out and the machine just stops. That's not bravery, Tez, don't make a face. It's a different childhood. The first thing the water teaches you is that you will go in it someday. And the second thing is that this is survivable if you keep your head. And the third thing is that a man who's already made peace with the swim is the most dangerous thing on any deck. I picked up the trays. He's never been horizontal in his life. The form master told me that himself. 26 fights, no falls, an entire identity made of one statistic. Tomorrow at first bell, one of us steps into that circle, terrified of the floor, and it isn't me. Before the dormitories dimmed, the institution itself took one quiet swing at the problem, because institutions always do. A runner brought me to the office of Registrar Velama, 3 tiers up, a room of pale stone and floating ledgers where the concourse keeps its actual nervous system, and the registrar, an elderly mon with the ballast of a person who has survived 40 years of other people's emergencies, offered me, with great courtesy, a door. The question can be dissolved, she said. There is provision. If the aspersion is withdrawn before first bell, formally in writing, the matter closes. No circle, no record beyond a procedural note. Cadet Avesh's table has indicated through channels that withdrawal would be received without prejudice. She let the ledgers drift a moment. You are 17 years old, Cadet Calder. You are 11 days from the end of a term you have passed with distinction, and you are proposing to stand in a formal circle against the finest technician this academy has produced in a generation. The institution would prefer you didn't. I am required to tell you the institution's preference. I am telling you. And the aspersion, I said, the altered table. If I withdraw, what happens to that? It ceases to exist, the registrar said, as a formal matter, and Cadet Tez's scores remain as posted. There would be no grounds to reopen them. There it was, laid out as clean as a tide table. The door out of the circle was real, and it was unlocked, and the price of walking through it was Tez, his scores standing falsified, his accusation evaporated, the machine rolling on with one more demonstration that the table's arithmetic always eventually closes. They weren't even being subtle about it. They didn't think they needed to be. The whole offer was built on the same assumption every machine in that place was built on, that no one carries weight they're free to set down. Respectfully, no, I said. The claim's mine, it stands. The registrar looked at me for a long moment, settling lower on her ballast, and what came off her wasn't disapproval. It was something closer to the way Lem had looked at me across his slate, a career bureaucrat updating a model she'd trusted for 40 years. For the record then, she said, and one of the floating ledgers turned itself toward me, the offer was made and declined. Go and sleep, Cadet. The hall opens at first bell. And as I reached the door, in the flat grammar that Mon borrow from the Imbrel when they want a sentence to carry, more weight than their office allows, 61 years, Cadet Calder. Whatever the stone says tomorrow, mind it lands on the right body. The concourse did not sleep on it quietly. By the time the dormitories dimmed, the freight spine log had been pulled and reposted a few hundred times with annotations in 9 scripts. An emergency faculty session convened and adjourned. Soon gave a statement to the senior council describing the gravity dial incident as training in the old style, which would have gone over better if the old style had ever previously included 4 seniors, a maintenance band, and second bell. And a runner came to my bunk at midnight with a gray slate from the office of the form master, which I have kept, and which read in full, terms are set. The Hall of Descent first bell, standard Vanderpool, the table petitioned for home gravity conditions and has been declined. The hall's plates have not been moved for 61 years and will not be moved for this. Descent rules oldest form. The circle is closed when one body other than feet touches the stone. Strikes within the form are permitted. I am required by my office to be neutral, and I will be. S, and below that, in smaller script, as close to a human postscript as Imbrel grammar bends. He has studied the assessment recordings. Cadet. Assume he knows what I know about the crossing moment. He will be patient. He will work the half-step sleep, eat at first call, and tape your hands. I read it twice, put it under my pillow, and did exactly those 3 things in that order. Around me the dormitory whispered and rustled and pretended not to watch my bunk. I lay there in the dark at the bottom of an alien sky, and I'll tell you what I actually thought about. Because it wasn't Avesh Koran, and it wasn't the circle, and it wasn't 61 years of anybody's statistics. I thought about the morning the Kittiwake took green water over the bow off Cape Stannard, the engine coughing, the deck of chaos of fouled line, and Roy in the wheelhouse window not shouting, never shouting, holding up one hand with his fingers spread. 5 things. Meaning there are only ever 5 things to do, Owen, and you only ever do them one at a time. Check your feet, check your hands. Find the load, take the strain, hold what you've got, and the weather will get bored before you do. It has never once failed me. That hand in the window. The sea is bigger than any of us, and it gets bored anyway. The concourse, for all its cloud glass, was a smaller sea than mine. I slept like a hold full of ice. First bell on Vandrel comes pale and silver, the cloud glass barely lit, and they were queuing at the Hall of Descent doors an hour before it rang. 4,000 cadets, give or take the sick bay, and most of the faculty, and Tez counted because numbers steadied him. Delegates from every species senior table, packed into the rings under those 40-foot ceilings, under the carved letters, under 61 years of one sentence never once having been argued with. I came in through the small door with my hands taped, in plain training grays, and the noise of 4,000 people went through one of those tide turns where it doubles and then dies. Avesh was already in the circle. Of course he was. Black training silks, sash off, forearms bare, the 9th cord knotted at his waist, and he stood in the center of the white stone the way I'd seen Selavar stand, a mast planted, and I will say this one time and not again. He was magnificent, and the room was his, and every soul in it believed the next 10 minutes belonged to the form. Form Master Selivar stepped to the circle's edge, raised one hand, and the concourse held its breath. "The question has been put and taken up," he said, flat grammar carrying everywhere. "The circle is open. It closes when the stone takes a body. Cadets, descend." 26 standing questions, and 26 of them had ended inside the first exchange. I knew it, he knew it, 4,000 spectators knew it, and so the first thing Avesh Korin did in the circle was the smartest thing he could possibly have done. Nothing, he circled, slow, poured, unhurried, forearms loose, keeping the full diameter between us, and I understood the play at once because it was good seamanship. He had read the Form Master's same chart of me. He knew grabbing the bollard had failed 3 times. He knew the freight spine. He wasn't going to feed me his wrists, and he wasn't going to spend his certainty in the first minute the way he'd spent it on day 9. He was going to do to me what the table had done all season: make time the weapon, make me cross to him, and wait for the half-step of doubt that lived in my weight transfer, mid-stride, where a master with perfect timing could find it. So the most-watched circle in 61 years of the concourse opened with 90 full seconds in which nobody touched anybody, and I want to tell you about those seconds because everyone who was there does. I didn't circle with him. That's a fencer's conversation, and I had no business in it. I took 3 steps to the dead center of the white stone, the one spot where every diameter is the same length, where there's no corner to be herded into, and I set my feet shoulder-wide, and I settled my weight down through my heels into the bones of the plateau, and I waited the way you wait out weather, hands loose, breathing through the rib. Watching his hips, not his eyes, because hips are where the lies aren't. 4,000 people watched a human boy stand still, and the stillness went out from the circle in rings like something dropped in a harbor. Tez told me afterward you could see it travel, benches going quiet section by section as it dawned on each species in its own time that the human wasn't going to perform, wasn't going to answer the beauty with beauty, that what had walked into their cathedral was something none of their classics had a name for. A man treating their 600-year art as weather, not an enemy, not a rival, just conditions on the day. Avesh broke first. He had to. The asymmetry was eating him. Every second I stood planted was a second the room's oldest sentence. The floor is the verdict. Hung there with no verdict in it, and an imbral air cannot live where verdicts won't come. He came in on the diagonal with a feint at my collar that turned into a low sweep at my ankle, fast as line snapping off a winch, and the sweep was true and it took my left boot clean off the stone, and found out what every wave that has ever taken a deckhand's boot finds out, which is that we are one-legged animals dozens of times a day, that a boot off the stone is Tuesday, that balance isn't a position, it's a job. I rode the sweep, foot back down, weight never crossing. The exchange took half a second. The sound the benches made was not a cheer. It was 4,000 people inhaling at once. He tried the grips next, because the grips had to be tested even though he knew the answer. You sound a channel even when the chart says it's shoaled. Both upper hands flickering at my collar, snapping back before my hands could close on his wrists. In and out, fishing, and that's the right word, fishing. And I have cleaned more fish than this man had thrown cadets. And the patience economy between us was never going to be close. Twice he hooked cloth and had to abandon it when my grip started up his forearm. The second abandonment cost him a half stumble in his retreat. Nothing, a few centimeters of lost dignity, and from the third ring came the sound of one guessy quill drum starting and being instantly sat on, which I knew, without looking, was Tez losing and regaining his composure in the space of a heartbeat. The benches were doing their own work by then. You learn to read a crowd the way you read a sky, and this one was changing layer by layer. The first years had come in loud, certain of their seniors' arithmetic. The faculty gallery had come in neutral. But the fourth years, the ones who'd spent 3 years learning exactly how much of everything the sixth descent ends, were leaning forward by the second minute, very quietly, the way men lean toward an instrument that's reading wrong in a way that matters. On the senior bench, Resivan sat like cargo. Soon wasn't talking. I have no idea what Selivar's face did, because I never once looked at it, and that, Tez told me after, was itself the thing half the gallery couldn't stop watching. The human fought the whole hour as if the room were empty. Then it began in earnest, and I will not pretend it was nothing, because it was the hardest hour of work I have done in my life, and I include the morning off Cape Stannard. He worked me like a craftsman. That's the truth, and it belongs in the record. He threw the name throws at me one after another, the hip turns, the shoulder wheels, the sacrifice entries where he'd drop his own level and try to lever me over the fulcrum of his thigh, and where the throws found bedrock he changed books entirely and went to strikes, because strikes within the form are permitted and the form strikes are not decorations. Long-knuckled, double-elbowed, whip-fast blows that came around corners no human arm owns. He found the rib in the first minute, of course he did. Othic had pulled the medical log or read it in how I'd guarded my left through 6 weeks of drills. He played that rib like a man working a fish, tap and turn and tap patient, making me pay 1 coin a breath for every anchor I kept, and I paid it. That's the other thing that belongs in the record. I paid in breath, and I paid in bruises, and once in the 4th minute I paid almost everything. He stitched 3 strikes into a collar feint, and the feint into the same timing trap the form master had caught me with at 3rd bell. The floor going out from under my crossing foot, the half-step of doubt blooming right where Selivar said it lived. And for 1 piece of 1 second, in front of 4,000 witnesses, Owen Calder was going over, what saved me wasn't technique. I want this understood by whoever finds this account, it's the whole point of it. What saved me was the gunwale of the Kitawake, 11 years of it, the body's pure stupid certainty that going over the side is dying, and that you do not die today. You go where the strength is. I didn't fight the trap, you don't fight the sea. I went down through it, dropped my level beneath his fulcrum, took his lower forearm in my right hand on the way past, and used his own planted frame as the rail held on. Stayed in the world. His arm took my weight for a quarter second. All of my weight, heavy world weight, dense-boned, 1G raised and corn-fed. And I heard, and the first 3 rings heard, the fine hollow architecture of that forearm creak like rigging. After that, he stopped hunting the ending and started hunting the hour. Minutes 5 through 8 were the clinch, his decision, not mine. He closed to where the whip strikes couldn't be loaded and the throws couldn't be entered, chest to chest, 4 arms working against 2, and tried to do to me at grips what the table had tried to do all season at policy. Make every breath cost more than it earned. It was the best idea he had all morning. It was also the moment I knew the day was mine, and I'll tell you the exact signal, because it's the kind of thing only tradesmen would notice. In the clinch, our forearms crossed, and I felt his muscles doing relay work, firing, resting, trading the load arm to arm to arm, the way a creature built of fast fibers has to. Mine weren't trading anything. The forearms that held him had spent 11 years holding lines that don't negotiate, and they run on the slow fibers, the all-shift fibers, the ones that don't bill by the minute. He was spending capital. I was spending interest. Somewhere in the 7th minute he understood it too. I felt the understanding arrive in his frame, a kind of grim bookkeeping going through all 4 of his arms at once, and he spent 3 more strikes on my rib for the information, and I paid them short breaths, honest coin. The benches had gone strange by then, not loud, wrong quiet. 4,000 people watching the longest standing question in the Academy's records grind past every model anyone had walked in with, and the models breaking made a kind of silence I'd only ever heard at sea in fog. When the engine stops and you realize how much of what you call quiet was actually machinery, we broke apart, reset, 9th minute. And the circle had changed, and everybody breathing in that hall knew what had changed, even the species with no word for it. He was tiring. I wasn't. It isn't mysterious. It's a work curve. The descent is a sprinter's art from a featherweight world. Explosive, elegant, built to end things in one exchange, because on the Imbrel homeworld it always ends in one exchange. Nothing in his 600 years of doctrine had ever asked him to do this at 7/10 of a G against a load that would not resolve. Every throw he'd spent had been a full-body withdrawal from a finite account, and every anchor I'd kept had been, I keep using the word because it's the only word, work. Steady state, hold what you've got, all-day work, the kind you pace by breathing, the kind I'd been doing since I was 11 with my hands in cold water. I had run stairs every night for a season at 1.1 G with 40 kilos on my shoulder. I was in the lightest gravity of my entire life, fighting one man with taped hands and nowhere to be until breakfast. Around the 12th minute, Avesh Koran stepped back to the edge of his reach and stood there with 3 of his forearms low. The creaked forearm carried a fraction inside the others, his breath visibly cycling through whatever Imbrel keep where their composure lives, and looked at me with what I'd watched build in him all hour and could now name. Not hatred, recognition. "You're not defending," he said. "Quiet. Just for the circle. Nothing I have touches the ground through you, you're not." And the musical voice did something I'd never heard it do, which was search for a word and fail in front of an audience. "What are you doing?" "Holding," I said. "It's called holding. It's most of my trade." "Until what?" "Until the weather gets bored." And the heir of the Koran line, undefeated in 26 questions, magnificent even now, stood in the only circle of his life that had ever lasted past one exchange, and understood, I watched it land, watched it go through him like a sounding, that the weather was him, that the form's whole cosmology had an error in its base table. The floor was never the verdict. The floor is just where verdicts get filed. The verdict is what you've got left when the other man is still standing there, breathing easy, watching your hips. He had one thing left, and we both knew what it was, and he was Imbrel to the keel, so he spent it. The 6th descent. The throw with the poem written about it. The full spiral, total commitment, everything on one number, both lower hands to the cord, both uppers to the collar, his whole gorgeous skeleton organizing itself into the single motion that 600 years of his people had refined for exactly one purpose: to make a held thing horizontal their throwing form had never lost. And it took hold of the human deckhand. Day 9, the spiral had hit my settled weight at full strength, off a fresh body with the whole account behind it, and had stopped like water hitting a piling. 13th minute of the longest question in concourse history. It came in off a spent body with a creaking forearm, and I felt the truth of it through his grip the instant it arrived. The way you feel a swell that's all height and no push. It wasn't going to move me. He'd known it wasn't going to move me. He'd thrown it anyway, because it was the last sentence of his book, and a man should finish his book. So I finished mine. My hands closed on his two lower wrists, lined Heller's hands, 11 years of cold water in them, and broke the cord grip the way you take up slack, no jerk, just less and less room in the world. Then I stepped, on purpose, through the crossing moment he'd hunted all hour, dared it to be there, and it wasn't, because doubt doesn't live in a man doing his trade. I dropped my level, took his collar and his cord the way the form's own first lesson teaches, the only technique of theirs I ever borrowed, and I'd learned it as the dummy, and I turned him over the fulcrum of my hip exactly the way you swing 800 pounds of crab pot inboard off. The boom. And here is the part they still tell at the concourse, the part that made it something other than a fight, and I want it told right, because I did it on purpose, and it is the only artful thing I have ever done. I didn't slam him. You never slam a load. Any greenhorn can drop a pot on the deck and crack it. The trade, the whole trade, is setting it down. I took Avesh Koran's full weight across my hip. All that magnificent hollow bone architecture suddenly slack with the understanding of what was happening, and I lowered him to the white stone the way you land something you intend to use again. Controlled, quiet. His back met the floor of the hall of descent, with a sound softer than a slate being set on a desk. And that sound, in the silence of 4,000 held breaths, was the loudest thing I have ever heard. The stone had taken a body. For the first time in his life, the air of the Koran line was horizontal, in the dead center of his own cathedral, under the carved sentence of his own people, and the man who'd put him there had done it gently. And there are species in that hall, Tez swears, that still don't have a settled translation for what the gentleness meant. Form Master Selavar's staff came down on the stone once. The circle is closed, he said, flat grammar carrying everywhere, neutral to the last joint of him. The question is answered, the aspersion stands. No cheering. I read accounts afterward that invented cheering, and they're wrong, and the wrongness matters. What happened in the Hall of Descent at first bell was a sound like the tide changing. 4,000 bodies shifting at once, 11 species recalibrating one shared assumption, and underneath it, here and there in the rings, the began and quickly smothered percussion of guessy cadets drumming their quills, which I'm told had not been heard in open hall in a generation. I wasn't watching the rings, I was watching the man on the floor. Because everything I'd said in the freight spine, every sermon I had in me, came down to the next 10 seconds, and I'd have traded the verdict to know how they'd go. Avesh Koran lay on his back on the stone and stared up at the cloud glass 40 feet over us, a man inventorying himself for a kind of damage that has no medical name, and finding the way every deckhand finds the first time the water takes him and gives him back, that he was somehow absurdly still alive. The floor had come at last, the lifelong verdict. The thing his whole line was organized around never feeling, and it was survivable. I watched that single fact arrive in him and begin very slowly to take the entire structure of his certainty apart, joint by joint, to rebuild it on different bedrock. I put my hand down into his field of vision and held it there. The hall went stiller than the verdict had made it. Imbril do not help each other rise. Rising alone is the last dignity of the fallen. It's in their oldest law, and so the hand hanging there between us wasn't a courtesy. It was the whole argument. Getting put down isn't the thing. It's never been the thing. He looked at the hand for 3 long seconds. Then 4 fingers with a creaked forearm behind them closed around my taped wrist, and Avesh Koran let a human deckhand take his weight in front of the species assembled and came up off the floor of the Hall of Descent like a man wading out of the sea. Holding, he said, just to me, testing the word like a footing. Lessons free. The next one you do with your own hands. What came after came fast, the way aftermath always does, and most of it isn't mine to tell in detail, so here's the log of it. The aspersion, having formally stood, obliged the registry to pull the thread, and the thread pulled the dead maintenance account, and the account pulled Othek's chits, and Othek, being the one of the 4 I'd have hired, declined to let it pull anyone else's. He took the falsification charge alone, lost his sash, and finished his term in cargo administration, where I'm told he was infuriatingly excellent. Soon talked. Soon talked to the senior counsel for 2 hours and left it with his sash intact and his standing gone, which for a talker is the harder sentence. Tez's scores were re-derived from the true table and posted publicly, top of his year, and the logistics faculty pinned the review where 4,000 cadets could read it. And the crest table, this is the part I'd have bet against, simply stopped. No abdication ceremony, no successor war. The next evening at mess, Avesh Koran carried his tray past the senior dais where his table had held court for 30 years, and sat down at an open bench among third years and began eating, and that was the entire event. Resavan looked at the empty dais for a long moment, the way a crane looks at a load that's been canceled, and then followed him. No fanfare. Aristocracy doesn't die of defiance, like I said. It dies of the man at the top of it sitting somewhere else. My own ledger closed quieter. One first chord requirement still stood against my name, 30 seconds in the circle against an instructor without disgraceful dissent, and 4 days before the term ended, Selivar convened the first years and called me to the center to clear it, and I'll record it because Tez insists the numbers belong somewhere official. The form master was 60 years deep in the art, and he did not condescend to me. He worked honestly, timing traps and level changes, and one entry I never saw begin. The hall counted the 30 seconds out loud. That was new. The counting. The yard tally had taught the first years the habit, and nobody had managed to unteach it. And at the count of 30, Selivar stepped back, straightened his robe, and addressed the rubric slate in the flat grammar of a man filing a weather report. Nakurant met. Notation. The instrument ran out before the cadet did. The instructor wishes the record to show he was present. Then to the hall, with the dryness I'd learned, lived under all that ceremony. The 30-second standard was set in an age when this academy had not yet admitted anyone raised at a full standard gravity with a working profession. The faculty may wish to consider whether it is examining cadets or examining the clock. It went into the record like that, verbatim. Tez keeps a copy. He says it's the funniest document in the registry, and Gessie archive humor is its own subject, but I take his word. The form master summoned me once more before the term closed. Third bell again, the hall empty and oyster-lit, and he stood in the circle where his student had learned to be horizontal, and he asked me the question I'd been dreading politely for weeks. The discipline you used, the holding, the breaking of grips, the setting down of the load. The form must study it. What is it called? It isn't called anything, form master. It's not a discipline. It's a job. Boats, cold water, heavy gear. Deck work. There's no book. There will be, Selivar said in the tone of a man who has already begun writing it, and the wide-set eyes did their amused thing. 600 years ago, the descent was carved out of exactly such a thing, dockhands on the river. Barges of the first cities, I have read the oldest scrolls holding loads in wind. We made it a form, and the form forgot the docks. You are not a new chapter, Cadet Calder. You are the first chapter. Come back to check on us. He refolded his arms. The faculty has voted to add a 10th study to the curriculum. Wait. It cannot be examined by throwing for reasons this term has made vivid. It will be examined by holding. I require a demonstration partner at the opening session. The post is traditionally given to a new cadet, without warning, without a bow. The demonstration dummy. Just so. I'll do it, I said, on one condition. You give the post its proper name. So it stands in the concourse curriculum to this day, written into the charter of the 10th study, the position every first year now hopes and dreads to be called to, the deckhand. The cadet who walks to the center of the circle and lets 600 years of beautiful technique take hold of them, so that a roomful of the galaxy's finest can learn the first lesson last, that there are bodies in this universe the floor has no jurisdiction over, and they are not born in cathedrals. I finished my 22 months, passed my boards high enough that 3 fleet recruiters made offers, and the concourse made a 4th instructor track, which I'm told had not been offered to a first contract human before. I thanked them, and I meant it, and I went home. The stipend cleared the engine and half the hull work besides. I stood on the dock at Standard Harbor in the rain with my sea bag on my right shoulder out of old habit, the rib long-heeled, and the kittiwake sat at her moorings looking small and rust-streaked and more serious than anything on Vandrel, because the sea she works doesn't have a charter or a rubric and has never once needed to carve its sentence over a door. Roy came down the ramp, looked me over the way a buyer looks at fish, and shook my hand. They teach you anything out there? He said. I thought about it the whole length of the dock, the gulls yelling on the pilings, the diesel and salt and rain of it, the green water waiting past the breakwater for the both of us, patient as a proctor. No, I said, but I taught them what we know. He nodded like that was the expected catch, and we went up the hill to look at the engine. They carved their verdict over a door 40 feet high, and every year now a new class files under it, and somewhere in the front ring a kid nobody's heard of gets called to the center without a bow. The floor is the verdict, the letters say. We never carved ours because you can't carve on water, and we wouldn't have needed to anyway. Ours is shorter. Stand up. That's it. That's the whole curriculum. Stand up and hold what you've got, and the weather, any weather, on any world will get bored before you do.